They expected torture. They received hamburgers. For thousands of Japanese soldiers captured in the Pacific War, this contradiction was more psychologically devastating than any interrogation could ever be. The enemy had violated every principle of warfare they understood, not through cruelty, but through kindness so incomprehensible it shattered their entire worldview. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. On December 8, 1941, as the smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor's burning battleships, a single Japanese submariner crawled onto Waimanalo Beach in Oahu, half-drowned and disoriented. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki had abandoned his crippled midget submarine after the attack failed, choosing the ocean over death inside his steel coffin. When American military police found him collapsed on the sand, they became the first Allied soldiers to capture a Japanese military prisoner in World War II. Sakamaki expected execution. He received medical treatment, dry clothes, and a meal. The dissonance between expectation and reality would define the experience of every Japanese prisoner who followed him into American captivity over the next 4 years. Sakamaki's confusion was not personal weakness. It was the product of a military indoctrination system that had spent years preparing Japanese soldiers for everything except survival. On January 8, 1941, 11 months before Pearl Harbor, War Minister Tojo Hideki issued the Senjinkan, the Field Service Code. This document did not merely discourage surrender. It transformed capture into a fate worse than annihilation. The code instructed every soldier and sailor that rather than live and bear the shame of imprisonment by the enemy, he should die and avoid leaving a dishonorable name. This was not metaphor. It was literal command, enforced through a culture that viewed surrender not as military necessity but as moral extinction. A captured soldier ceased to exist in the eyes of his family, his nation, and his emperor. His name would be struck from family records. His relatives would receive no pension, no honor, no acknowledgement of his service. He became a ghost while still breathing. This psychological architecture explains why Pacific battlefields produced ratios of death to capture that defied all military logic. On Guadalcanal between January and February 1943, American 14 Corps killed thousands of Japanese soldiers while taking only 84 prisoners, and 33 of those captives were too wounded or unconscious to resist. The Burma campaign yielded 142 Japanese prisoners against 17,166 enemy dead. At Tarawa, Marines faced suicidal banzai charges from defenders who preferred death by rifle fire to the dishonor of raised hands. These were not tactical decisions. They were the product of years of indoctrination that rewired Japanese soldiers' survival instincts, replacing self-preservation with self-destruction as the honorable choice. The few who survived capture did so accidentally. Some were blown unconscious by artillery. Others were too badly wounded to pull the trigger on themselves. A handful simply found themselves surrounded with no ammunition left, their moment of honorable suicide passing before they realized it. And when they woke in American field hospitals or prisoner collection points, they faced a cognitive crisis for which their training offered no guidance. The Senjinkan had prepared them for death. It had not prepared them for mercy. By February 1942, Ensign Sakamaki found himself transferred from Sand Island, Hawaii, to the continental United States, where he remained the only Japanese military prisoner in American hands for 6 months. The War Department was building a prisoner network designed for a different war, one against Germany and Italy, where surrender was understood as a temporary suspension of hostilities governed by international law. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established clear protocols for prisoner treatment. Germany had signed it. Italy had signed it. Japan had not. Yet the United States War Department decided to apply Geneva standards anyway, calculating that consistent adherence might protect the 16,100 American servicemen already in Japanese hands. It was a hope that would prove tragically misplaced, but it shaped the American approach to every Japanese prisoner who arrived on American soil. The infrastructure built for German and Italian prisoners would eventually accommodate 425,000 Axis captives in camps stretching from New York to California. Each permanent camp averaged 2,500 prisoners and adhered to Geneva requirements, barrack standards identical to American forces, medical facilities, sanitation systems, recreational areas. The War Department selected sites at or near existing military installations, both for security and efficiency. By mid-1943, the system included 500 main and branch camps capable of processing 20,000 new prisoners monthly from the European theater. The Pacific War, however, produced prisoners at a drastically different rate. Through the entire battles of the Java Sea, Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, Savo Island, Bismarck Sea, New Guinea, Kula Gulf, Bougainville, Tarawa, and Markin, Allied forces captured only 604 Japanese soldiers. Not 600,000. 604. Multiple factors explained this disparity. Beyond the cultural prohibition on surrender, American troops in the Pacific quickly learned to fear Japanese battlefield tactics. Soldiers who appeared to surrender sometimes detonated hidden grenades. Wounded men reached for concealed weapons when medics approached. The widely publicized treacherousness of the enemy, a phrase that appeared in official Pentagon histories without quotation marks or qualification, made frontline troops reluctant to accept surrender even when offered. Heat-of-battle killings of Japanese attempting to give up were common enough that military after-action reports acknowledged the problem in careful, bureaucratic language that avoided direct culpability while confirming the practice occurred. The few Japanese who survived capture and reached American holding facilities entered a system they could not comprehend. On arrival at Angel Island, California, a converted immigration quarantine station in San Francisco Bay, prisoners underwent processing that contradicted everything their training had predicted. They were deloused, not tortured. Their belongings were disinfected, not stolen. They received medical examinations, not executions. Those with malaria, syphilis, intestinal parasites, or combat wounds received treatment at the camp or at Letterman General Hospital in San Francisco. When issued prisoner of war registration cards and told to notify their families through the International Red Cross, nearly all Japanese captives refused. Better to be believed dead than known to be captured. Then came the meals. The menu at Camp Angel Island on September 16, 1944, listed sausages, rice, brown crusts, apples, coffee, milk, and sugar for breakfast. Lunch featured sukiyaki, cabbage salad, rice, caramel pudding, and water. Dinner included spaghetti and hash, baked tomatoes, lettuce and tomato salad, rice, cakes, and cocoa. The quantity exceeded what most prisoners had eaten as soldiers in the Imperial Japanese military. The quality surpassed anything they had known on remote Pacific islands, where supply lines collapsed and garrisons subsisted on single rice balls per day, when rice remained at all. By 1944, starvation killed more Japanese soldiers than combat. On Guadalcanal, 15,000 of 20,000 Japanese deaths resulted from malnutrition and related disease, not bullets or bombs. The 18th Japanese Army in New Guinea saw 79% casualties, with the vast majority dying from hunger rather than enemy action. Some garrisons resorted to consuming bark, grass, and, in documented cases, human flesh. The prisoners arriving at Angel Island came from this world of systematic starvation. They had watched comrades die slowly from vitamin deficiencies, beriberi, and dysentery. They had become accustomed to bodies that consumed themselves, muscle tissue converting to fuel as fat reserves vanished and organs began to fail. The average Japanese soldier's weight dropped from 60 kilograms before deployment to 54 kilograms by 1945. Many fell below 50. Their gastrointestinal systems had adapted to near-starvation conditions. And now they faced American prison camp meals calculated to maintain prisoner health and prevent weight loss, a Geneva Convention requirement the United States took seriously even when Japan did not reciprocate. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. American intelligence officers studying prisoner psychology identified 3 distinct phases in Japanese captive behavior. In the first 48 hours after capture, prisoners provided unreliable information, certain they faced imminent torture and execution. Between days 3 and 14, a transformation occurred. Realizing they would not be harmed, prisoners became grateful to the point of eagerness. They talked freely, answering questions with detail their interrogators had not expected. This was the window intelligence officers learned to exploit. After 2 weeks, captives grew accustomed to good treatment, became annoyed at continued questioning, and retreated into sullen indifference. The timing mattered. The War Department needed useful information from these men: order of battle data, equipment specifications, garrison locations, morale assessments, command personalities, and they had perhaps 10 days to extract it. From Angel Island, prisoners deemed valuable for intelligence purposes transferred to Camp Tracy, California, officially designated P.O. Box 651 Tracy, Cal. The facility's true location was Byron Hot Springs, an isolated site west of San Francisco hidden behind 8-foot fences, barred windows, and heavy gates. Construction workers who built the installation believed they were creating an officers' school, though the hidden microphones in cell blocks and reinforced interrogation rooms suggested otherwise. The War Department kept Camp Tracy's existence secret throughout the war. Geneva Convention articles prohibiting coercive interrogation techniques were, in the words of later Pentagon assessments, bent to extract maximum intelligence from Japanese captives before they lost their psychological vulnerability. Washington justified this through calculation. Japan had already demonstrated that it would not honor Geneva protections for American prisoners, and the potential military intelligence gained from Japanese captives might save American lives on future battlefields. The interrogations at Tracy ran from 1943 through 1945, processing thousands of prisoners through a rotating staff of 45 American intelligence officers, many of them Japanese-American linguists from the Military Intelligence Service Language School in Minnesota. Each interrogator was assigned to a specific prisoner, conducting interviews that lasted 45 minutes to an hour, 2 or 3 times daily, for a week or longer. The sessions followed detailed checklists covering military equipment, fuel supplies, rations, troop morale, commander personalities, tactical doctrines, and rumors circulating in garrison camps. The reports produced were concise, typically 2 or 3 single-spaced pages, and frequent. Rather than risk losing critical information, interrogators forwarded findings every 4 days. The intelligence gathered ranged from the deteriorating quality of Japanese uniforms to the number of boiler rooms in the aircraft carrier Hiryu. During 1944 alone, Camp Tracy processed 1,077 Japanese prisoner interrogations, producing thousands of intelligence reports that fed into tactical planning across the Pacific Theater. The interrogation technique itself violated Japanese military expectations. American officers conducted sessions in informal atmospheres, without threats or physical intimidation. The contrast with Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners was stark. Where Japanese camps applied systematic brutality as policy, American facilities offered cigarettes and patience. Where Japanese interrogators used starvation as leverage, American intelligence officers discovered that simply threatening to notify a prisoner's family in Japan proved more effective than any physical coercion. For men already consumed by shame, the prospect of relatives learning of their dishonor represented a psychological pressure more devastating than torture. Many prisoners, believing their existence as Japanese had ended with capture, discarded their former values entirely. American officers reported that hardened veterans who had fought for years suddenly offered detailed information on ammunition dump locations, drew maps of Japanese defensive positions, wrote anti-war propaganda leaflets, and, in several documented cases, volunteered to fly as guides on American bombing missions to identify military targets. Some prisoners formed what they called the Japanese People's Emancipation League, announcing they had been misled by the emperor and the military clique and wished to fight alongside Allied forces back to Japan. This was not Stockholm Syndrome in the modern psychological sense. It was the logical endpoint of a binary indoctrination system that offered soldiers only 2 identities: honorable Japanese warrior or dishonored non-person. Having failed to die in battle, many prisoners unconsciously adopted the second identity completely, severing all loyalty to their former cause because the cause had already severed them. They had crossed a psychological threshold from which there was no return. If they were no longer Japanese, if their names had been struck from family registers, if the emperor had abandoned them, then what remained except to serve whoever would acknowledge their existence? After interrogation, prisoners were distributed to permanent camps across the United States based on available space and transportation logistics. The War Department's prisoner network by 1944 included camps in Wisconsin, Iowa, Maryland, Texas, Washington, and California. The largest concentration of Japanese prisoners, 2,762 men at peak capacity, resided at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Originally a civilian conservation corps site from 1935, McCoy sat 5 miles outside Sparta, Wisconsin, isolated but accessible via the Milwaukee Railway between Milwaukee and Minneapolis. The camp had begun receiving enemy aliens in March 1942, 106 Germans, 5 Italians, 181 Japanese, and expanded steadily as the war progressed. By 1945, McCoy housed nearly 3,000 Japanese prisoners, 1,000 Germans, and 500 Koreans captured while serving in the Imperial Japanese military. The Japanese occupied compounds 1 and 2, living in converted CCC barracks with 50 Army double-deck bunks each. Additional structures served as mess halls, day rooms equipped with furniture, playing cards, gramophones, and Japanese language books donated by the YMCA. Geneva Convention requirements mandated camp canteens where prisoners could purchase toiletries, candy, cigarettes, soft drinks, and locally grown produce at market prices. Some camps permitted beer and light wine. Enlisted prisoners received 80 cents daily in canteen coupons, enough to buy 8 packs of cigarettes or 8 bottles of beer at 1944 prices. Officers received graduated salaries, lieutenants earned $15 monthly, captains $25, majors through generals $35. These funds existed as U.S. Treasury Trust Fund credits, disbursed in canteen coupons rather than real currency to prevent bribery or escape financing. The food served at American prisoner camps followed War Department regulations requiring rations equal in quantity and quality to those provided American troops at base camps. This standard transformed meals into diplomatic weapons more effective than any interrogation technique. The 1929 Geneva Convention specified that the food ration of prisoners of war shall be equal to that of troops at base camps and further required that basic daily food rations shall be sufficient in quantity, quality, and variety to keep prisoners of war in good health and to prevent loss of weight or the development of nutritional deficiencies. The United States adhered to this requirement religiously, not from altruism but from the desperate hope that Japanese authorities might reciprocate for American prisoners, a hope that proved futile as reports of starvation, disease, and systematic abuse in Japanese camps reached Washington throughout the war. But the policy stood. Every Japanese prisoner in American camps ate the same rations American soldiers received. This meant meat multiple times weekly, fresh vegetables, bread made from refined flour, milk, coffee, sugar, butter, canned fruit, desserts. The caloric intake alone exceeded 3,000 calories daily when Japanese frontline troops subsisted on perhaps 1,500 calories in the best circumstances and far less on bypassed island garrisons. The psychological impact intensified when camps began adjusting menus to accommodate national preferences. On July 1, 1944, the War Department notified camp commanders that Japanese prisoners were to receive substantially more fresh vegetables and rice. German prisoners got additional pork, sausage, and fish soups. Italians received spaghetti and dishes heavily seasoned with paprika, onions, and olive oil. The goal was practical: prisoners who ate food they recognized threw away less waste. The decision to serve hamburgers on Fridays was not symbolic. It was logistical. Hamburger meat was inexpensive, easily prepared in large quantities, familiar to American cooks, and calorie-dense, ideal for feeding thousands of prisoners simultaneously. By the 1940s, hamburgers had evolved from working-class street food into an American cultural staple, accessible to all economic classes. Beef was plentiful and cheap compared to other proteins, making ground beef patties cost-effective for mass feeding. When White Castle standardized hamburger preparation in the 1920s, they elevated burgers from dubious street vendor offerings to respectable meals served in clean establishments with visible food preparation. Other chains followed. By World War II, hamburgers represented quintessential American eating: fast, filling, affordable, unpretentious. For Japanese prisoners, hamburgers represented something else entirely: undeniable proof of American material abundance. Ground beef formed into patties and served with bread, cheese, lettuce, tomato, and condiments required agricultural and industrial capacity they had been told did not exist. Japanese wartime propaganda had consistently depicted the United States as a decadent nation weakened by luxury, incapable of sustaining long campaigns, certain to collapse under Japanese military pressure. Prisoners arriving from starvation garrisons had internalized these narratives. They expected American forces to show signs of privation. Instead, they encountered prison camps serving hamburgers, French fries, and Coca-Cola as routine Friday meals. The Coca-Cola presence was itself a psychological operation, though not intentionally directed at prisoners. In 1943, Coca-Cola President Robert Woodruff had declared that every American serviceman, wherever stationed, should be able to buy a Coca-Cola for 5 cents. The company deployed 64 portable bottling plants across Europe and the Pacific, staffed by 148 employees nicknamed Coca-Cola Colonels who built distribution networks in combat zones. By war's end, Coca-Cola had distributed 5 billion bottles to American forces. The military provided the company with sugar, a rationed commodity domestically, in exchange for morale services. Service members wrote home that they were fighting, among other things, for the right to drink Coca-Cola. The beverage became synonymous with American culture, freedom, and material plenty. When prisoners saw Coca-Cola served in camp canteens alongside hamburgers and other foods, the propaganda collapsed under empirical reality. They had been told America was weak. This was not weakness. They had been told American civilians starved while resources went to the military. Yet prisoners ate better than Imperial Japanese soldiers had eaten even before the war. The disconnect between what they had believed and what they experienced created cognitive dissonance so severe that some prisoners initially refused to believe the food was real. They suspected American authorities were staging elaborate deceptions, feeding them luxuriously to extract confessions or film propaganda showing well-treated prisoners. This paranoia persisted for weeks in some cases, prisoners whispering among themselves about ulterior motives while consuming meals that contradicted their suspicions through sheer nutritional reality. The transition from suspicion to acceptance varied by individual, but a pattern emerged in camp reports. Prisoners who had been captured most recently, those whose time in American custody counted in weeks rather than months, exhibited greatest distrust of their treatment. They cross-examined older prisoners about whether torture or starvation was coming, whether the good food was temporary, whether executions occurred after interrogations ended. The veterans reassured newcomers that conditions were genuine and permanent. In multiple documented cases, recently captured prisoners came to interrogators days after their initial sessions to correct or clarify information they had provided, explaining they had discussed details with other prisoners and wanted to ensure accuracy. This behavior, voluntary return to correct previous statements, was virtually unprecedented in prisoner interrogation and reflected the peculiar psychology of men who had lost their former identities and sought validation through cooperative behavior with their captors. Friday hamburger meals became focal points of this psychological transformation. Unlike rice or vegetables, which Japanese prisoners recognized from their own military service, hamburgers were unmistakably American. The combination of ground beef, processed cheese, sliced pickles, ketchup, mustard, and a soft white bun represented a cultural package prisoners could not reinterpret as anything other than authentically American abundance. When served with French fries, another American staple, and Coca-Cola, the meal became a complete demonstration of the industrial food system that supported American military operations. Prisoners understood implicitly that armies running food distribution networks capable of serving hamburgers to captives possessed logistical capacity far beyond what Japanese propaganda had suggested. The meals also forced prisoners to confront their own military's failure to provide adequate rations. Many Japanese prisoners had spent months or years on Pacific Islands where supply lines had collapsed completely. They had watched comrades die slowly from malnutrition-related diseases, beriberi from thiamine deficiency, pellagra from niacin deficiency, scurvy from vitamin C deficiency. They had seen men lose teeth, develop night blindness, suffer neurological damage from dietary inadequacies. The Japanese military diet, even in ideal circumstances, centered on rice with minimal protein and vegetables. Under combat conditions, rations degraded to single rice balls daily, then half rice balls, then nothing except whatever could be foraged or, in desperation, obtained through means soldiers preferred not to remember. The contrast between their experience and American prisoner treatment was not merely quantitative. It was categorical. Work assignments further reinforced prisoners' awareness of American material capacity. Geneva Convention Article 27 permitted belligerents to utilize able-bodied prisoners, officers excepted, for labor that did not directly aid the war effort. The United States implemented this provision in January 1943, putting prisoners to work on military base maintenance and, where security permitted, contract work for private employers. German and Italian prisoners worked readily, viewing labor as preferable to boredom. Japanese prisoners proved more problematic. 15 to 20% refused work assignments, some citing unwillingness to support the American war effort, others caught in internal conflicts between Army and Navy prisoners or disputes over command hierarchies within the prisoner community. The War Department responded with what it termed administrative pressure, restricted diets and reduced privileges for non-working prisoners. This was not punishment, authorities reasoned, since prisoners could terminate restrictions by complying with work orders. The policy produced mixed results. Some prisoners calculated that reduced rations in American camps still exceeded what they had received as soldiers and continued refusing assignments. Others worked but performed poorly, either through passive resistance or genuine unfamiliarity with American tools and methods. A third group embraced labor with the same totality they had once embraced military service, transferring their identity from Japanese soldiers to model prisoners who took pride in efficient work performance. This psychological division, between those who clung to remnants of their former identity and those who adopted new identities completely, created internal tensions within prisoner compounds. At Camp McCoy, Ensign Sakamaki served as spokesman for Japanese prisoners, filing endless complaints with camp authorities. The prisoners objected to working with American women in the camp laundry. They resented being housed with Marshall Islanders they considered racially inferior. They demanded coal for barracks stoves instead of provided firewood. They wanted more books, more dictionaries, American supervision removed during Saturday cleaning routines. On several occasions, Sakamaki bypassed the American camp commander and lodged grievances with the Spanish embassy in Washington, which represented Japanese interests under international protocols. Each complaint triggered visits from the Spanish consul in Chicago, who investigated and smoothed difficulties, though both sides recognized the protests often reflected prisoner power struggles rather than genuine grievances. The rivalry between Japanese Army and Navy prisoners constituted the most persistent internal conflict. Both services blamed the other for battlefield defeats. Naval prisoners outnumbered Army captives and dominated compound leadership, creating resentment among Army prisoners who viewed naval personnel as less disciplined. Each new group of prisoners from later battles arrived with fresher military honors, enabling them to look down on those captured earlier. The timing of capture became a status marker. Those taken in 1944 had resisted longer than those taken in 1942, therefore bore less shame, therefore commanded more respect. This created layered hierarchies of dishonor, with each group anxious about the arrival of the next wave of captives who would judge them as their predecessors had judged those before. The suicide question permeated compound life. While the number of successful suicides remained remarkably low, fewer than a dozen across all American camps throughout the war, the pressure to attempt suicide remained constant for some prisoners. "We wanted to die and yet we could not die," Sakamaki would later write. "We wanted to kill ourselves and we could not." This dramatic phrasing overstated reality. American camps provided no obvious suicide methods, but determined prisoners could have found ways. The absence of mass suicide suggests that many prisoners, once acclimated to captivity, discovered they preferred living with dishonor to dying with honor. This realization itself generated shame, creating recursive loops of guilt that some prisoners resolved by fully abandoning their former values while others maintained uncomfortable coexistence between incompatible belief systems. The hardliners, prisoners who rejected cooperation and advocated maintaining military discipline and eventual suicide, never numbered more than a small minority, but their presence intimidated others. They challenged the compound's senior prisoner, Naval Lieutenant Commander Kamitaro Matsumoto, for promoting peaceful hobbies and cooperation with Americans. They attempted to enforce military hierarchy and punishment systems that American authorities officially prohibited. In several camps, fights broke out between prisoners, usually involving disputes over work assignment compliance, perceived collaboration, or service branch rivalries. Camp commanders dealt with these incidents through segregation when possible, placing troublesome prisoners in separate compounds or transferring them to different facilities. The goal was preventing violence while maintaining the Geneva-mandated regime that kept prisoners healthy, occupied, and segregated from American troops. Japanese prisoners also had to navigate relationships with other nationalities. At Camp McCoy, German prisoners in adjacent compounds alternated between studied indifference and open mockery toward their nominal Japanese allies. The Germans viewed Japanese prisoners as racially inferior, gesturing and mimicking across the fence that separated compounds. Every evening proved potentially explosive as all nationalities shared the same canteen, barber shop, and PX facilities. They consumed their daily ration of 2 bottles of 3.2% beer in tense silence, each group pretending the others did not exist. Relations between Japanese and Korean prisoners proved even worse, reflecting centuries of Japanese colonization and discrimination against Korea. Captured Koreans, technically Japanese military personnel but culturally and ethnically Korean, used captivity to assert independence. They requested Christian Bibles and material to make Korean flags, requests camp authorities granted gladly as they highlighted Axis disunity. This disunity revealed itself repeatedly in camp administration reports. At Camp McCoy, officials observed that the biggest weakness of Axis forces was cultural non-cooperation and tribalism. Japanese and German prisoners refused to work together or associate. Pro-Nazi Germans bullied and assaulted non-Nazi Germans. Everyone disdained Italians. Japanese Army and Navy prisoners spent more energy undermining each other for control of work rosters than they spent on any cooperative endeavor. They considered their own allies and partner services nearly as much of an enemy as the Americans, if not more so, one camp report concluded. The observation contained strategic implications. Armies that could not maintain internal cohesion even in captivity likely suffered similar dysfunction on active battlefields. As the war progressed and American forces advanced across the Pacific, prisoner numbers increased dramatically. The few dozen Japanese captives of 1942 became hundreds in 1943, then thousands in 1944 and 1945. The increase reflected not Japanese soldiers' greater willingness to surrender but American forces' improved ability to capture wounded and unconscious enemy personnel before they could complete suicide attempts. Medical advances played a role. So did tactical adaptations. Marines and Army units learned to secure positions quickly after assaults, disarming wounded Japanese before they regained consciousness. The result was more prisoners surviving the immediate post-capture period and entering the processing pipeline that led from field hospitals to interrogation centers to permanent camps. The prisoners arriving in 1945 came from a collapsing empire. They had witnessed not just battlefield defeats but systemic military breakdown. Supply lines had ceased functioning. Officers abandoned garrisons. Units fragmented into starving bands scrounging for food. Some prisoners reported that their commanders had ordered them to disperse and survive individually rather than die in futile last stands. Others had been too weak from malnutrition to resist capture even had they wished to. Their physical condition on arrival shocked American medical personnel who had treated combat casualties for years. These were not wounded soldiers. They were walking skeletons, weighing 40 to 45 kilograms instead of 60, suffering advanced stages of beriberi and pellagra, their bodies consuming themselves to survive. Many required months of carefully calibrated refeeding to prevent refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal condition when severely malnourished patients receive too much nutrition too quickly. For these prisoners, Hamburger Fridays represented something beyond cultural shock or propaganda contradiction. They represented biological salvation. The protein in ground beef provided amino acids their bodies desperately needed. The carbohydrates in buns offered glucose their brains required for basic function. The vegetables, tomatoes, lettuce, pickles, contained vitamins that prevented scurvy and night blindness. The French fries contributed calories and salt their electrolyte-depleted systems craved. Even the Coca-Cola, dismissed by some observers as frivolous American excess, delivered sugar for immediate energy and caffeine that helped prisoners stay alert during recovery. The meals were carefully calculated to restore prisoners to health without overwhelming metabolic systems adapted to starvation. The psychological impact of this restoration process was profound and irreversible. Prisoners who arrived expecting death and received medical care, who anticipated torture and received hamburgers, who prepared for dishner and instead gained weight and health they had never known even as soldiers, these men could not return to their previous worldview unchanged. Some maintained anger at the United States for destroying their nation while simultaneously acknowledging gratitude for personal survival. Others compartmentalized their experience, treating American captivity as an inexplicable aberration disconnected from the larger war. Many simply accepted that everything they had been taught about the enemy was false and recalibrated their understanding accordingly. The War Department monitored these psychological shifts carefully through regular camp inspections. YMCA representatives visited monthly, noting prisoner morale and requesting additional recreational supplies. International Red Cross delegates inspected camps quarterly, documenting compliance with Geneva standards. Spanish embassy officials responded to prisoner complaints, investigating conditions and mediating disputes. Each inspection produced detailed reports that flowed back to Washington, where analysts tracked patterns across all POW camps. The system was designed to prevent abuses while extracting maximum intelligence value from prisoners during their psychologically vulnerable period after capture. It succeeded, though at the cost of creating thousands of men who existed in psychological limbo between their destroyed former identity and an uncertain future. As the war approached its end in summer 1945, American authorities faced the question of what to do with thousands of Japanese prisoners who could not return home without facing persecution or execution as traitors. The Japanese government had not acknowledged most prisoners' existence. Families believed them dead. No legal or social infrastructure existed to reintegrate men who had violated the fundamental cultural prohibition on surrender. Some prisoners expressed willingness to remain in the United States rather than return to Japan. Others requested transfer to Allied-controlled territories where they might live anonymously. A few insisted on repatriation regardless of consequences, preferring certain punishment in Japan to indefinite exile. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945, and Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast on August 15 resolved some questions while creating others. The Emperor's personal order for all Japanese forces to lay down arms theoretically absolved prisoners of individual responsibility for surrender. If the Emperor commanded surrender, then accepting captivity after August 15 carried no shame. This logic provided face-saving justification for prisoners to acknowledge their status and accept repatriation. But it did not erase years of captivity before the Emperor's order, nor did it address prisoners' complex relationships with American captors who had fed and cared for them while their own military had abandoned them to starvation. The repatriation process began slowly in late 1945 and accelerated through 1946. The United States retained approximately 70,000 Japanese prisoners until late 1946, using them for labor details clearing wreckage, rebuilding infrastructure, and recovering remains in devastated Pacific territories. Japanese prisoners in American camps received notice of their eventual return home but remained uncertain of their reception. Would families accept them? Would communities shun them? Would authorities prosecute them? The answers varied by individual circumstance, location, and the chaotic conditions in occupied Japan. Some prisoners returned to families who welcomed them quietly, grateful for survival even if ashamed of the means. Others found their homes destroyed, families scattered, communities struggling with devastation that dwarfed concerns about individual dishonor. A few faced legal or social consequences, but most simply disappeared into the vast population of demobilized soldiers, war widows, orphans, and displaced persons trying to rebuild shattered lives. In 1946, Camp McCoy processed its last Japanese prisoners for repatriation. The barracks were dismantled or repurposed. The guard towers came down. The barbed wire was rolled up and stored. The camp reverted to its training mission, preparing new American soldiers for a Cold War that would dominate the next half-century. But the legacy of the Hamburger Fridays and Coca-Cola canteens persisted in unexpected ways. Thousands of Japanese men carried memories of American prisoner treatment into post-war Japan. They became living contradictions to wartime propaganda, men who had experienced the enemy's abundance firsthand and could not deny what they had eaten, drunk, and witnessed. Some remained silent about their captivity, knowing their families would prefer forgetting. Others shared their experiences carefully, describing American industrial capacity and logistical competence in ways that influenced post-war Japanese economic development and US-Japan relations. The American strategy of adhering to Geneva standards despite Japanese non-reciprocity appeared foolish to critics who noted that American prisoners died in horrific conditions while Japanese captives ate hamburgers in Wisconsin. The moral asymmetry was undeniable. But the policy produced several strategic benefits beyond the humanitarian satisfaction of maintaining civilized standards. First, it provided actionable intelligence during the critical 1943 to 1945 period when Japanese prisoners' psychological vulnerability made them willing sources. Second, it demonstrated American material abundance in ways that demoralized future captives and influenced post-war reconstruction. Third, it created a moral high ground that served American diplomatic interests in occupied Japan and beyond. The long-term impact on Japanese prisoners themselves remains difficult to quantify. Ensign Sakamaki eventually returned to Japan, where he lived quietly until his death in 1999, rarely speaking publicly about his captivity. Other prisoners scattered across post-war Japan, some thriving, others struggling, all carrying the psychological weight of having survived when honor demanded death. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola they consumed became private memories, rarely discussed but never forgotten, tangible evidence that the world was more complex than military indoctrination had suggested and that enemies were not always what propaganda claimed. The story of Japanese prisoners and American food reveals warfare's psychological dimensions as clearly as any battle analysis. The United States did not win hearts and minds through humanitarian treatment of captives. It did not convert thousands of Imperial Japanese soldiers into American sympathizers through hamburger diplomacy. But it did systematically demonstrate that everything those soldiers believed about American weakness, decadence, and impending collapse was demonstrably false. Every Friday hamburger meal was an intelligence operation conducted through calories rather than interrogation, proving through empirical evidence that the Empire of Japan had miscalculated catastrophically when it attacked Pearl Harbor and assumed American will would break under pressure. For the men who ate those hamburgers, who drank that Coca-Cola, who gained weight and health in captivity that exceeded what they had known in service, the experience was less about conversion than about confronting undeniable reality. They had been taught to prefer death to capture. They lived, and discovered that living came with complications their training had not addressed. They had been taught that Americans were cruel, weak, and materialistic. They encountered systematic kindness backed by industrial abundance. They had been taught that surrender meant extinction. They survived, and had to decide what that survival meant. 70 years after the last Japanese prisoners left American camps, the historical irony remains striking. The nation that brutalized prisoners won no strategic advantage from cruelty. The nation that fed prisoners hamburgers and respected Geneva standards gained intelligence, demonstrated strength, and created thousands of living testaments to American capacity. Neither approach prevented war or guaranteed victory. But one created men who spent the rest of their lives unable to forget that their enemy had treated them better than their own government had, and that the hamburgers they ate on Friday afternoons in Wisconsin were more real and more nourishing than any propaganda they had ever believed. The psychological warfare was complete before the prisoners realized they were participants. They expected torture chambers and found mess halls. They prepared for Dishner and found weight gain. They anticipated death and instead lived to remember Fridays when the menu listed hamburgers, French fries, and Coca-Cola, 3 items that represented everything they had been taught to despise about American culture but which their bodies gratefully accepted as proof that survival was possible even after honor was lost. That contradiction never resolved. It simply became part of their history, a secret shared by thousands of men who learned that food could be more powerful than bullets when deployed against soldiers who had forgotten what it meant to be fed. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.